Okay, we're running ever so slightly behind time, so I'm just going to make a start. Thank you. Not sure where everyone's gone, but your Lord Lister, distinguished guests, welcome to our second panel discussion of the day, Reskilling the Workforce for a Post-Carbon Energy Sector. It's great to see a lot of familiar faces in the room, but for those of you who don't know me, my name is Paul Sharkey, and I'm the Deputy Director of the Business Council. Skills is an important area that cuts across all of our sector-based work, and is a theme that we are discussing today very much at the request of our member companies. I would now like to hand over to our moderator, Ryan McPherson. Ryan is the Regional Director for the Middle East, Africa and Russia at the Energy Industries Council, and will guide our panelists through what I'm sure will be a really interesting discussion. This session will be around 45 minutes in length. Ryan, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul, and thank you, Brad, and the UUBC for inviting. You've got your topics bang on, because it sounds like the first panel led very nicely into some of the discussions we're going to have today in this panel. And as Paul mentioned, my name is Ryan McPherson. I've been based in the UAE now for almost 12 years, but as you'll pick up from my accent, I am local to Aberdeen, so it's absolutely great to be back here and in a familiar situation here. But I know Rauda's just stopped out the room for a second, but I found it really interesting. She said back in 2009, she looked at the renewables and thought, why? I moved out to Abu Dhabi just a year after that and moved into Masdar City that a few people have talked about as it was still just being built. And I looked at that and went, wow. I came from a traditional oil and gas out to the Middle East to see this renewable journey that they were already embarking upon with this big master plan. And at that point, that was probably the second reskilling that I had done in my career, having originally come from public sector here in Aberdeen. But I think that showed that the appetite for the UAE, and over the course of that time, I was one of the first tenants in Masdar City when it was just porta cabins and they were using you out towards MBZ, where they had to outsource another building, but fantastic there. And I think what we've seen over this time is that figures published just a few weeks ago showed that the UAE recorded the largest increase in renewable energy capacity globally in the past decade. So they really are doubling down on the renewables in the UAE and the region as a whole. But if I maybe do some scene setting before I just come to the panel, we've picked up on this previously about the reskilling, and I think the energy industry is probably going under one of its major, if not the biggest, transition as we move towards this net zero world, where we talk about technologies and energy sources. But I noticed the comment that was made, I think it was Mercedes that had said there, it's the people that are going to bring it to life. I think we've seen that there are already 12 million jobs in renewable sector with further booms to come. And this is from IRENA, who are based on our doorstep in Abu Dhabi at Masdar. But closer to home, I arrived here over the weekend and picked up a copy of the Press and Journal, where one of the big stories was about an Aberdeen-based recruitment specialist, Eden Scott. They were talking about the market recovering to levels not seen during the last boom from 2011 through to 2014. But the jobs aren't being driven from what we would class as traditional oil and gas. It's tech and renewable sectors that are now driving this. So I find that quite interesting. And often we overlook the skills and training that are required, but the challenge for this is huge. So as this gathers pace, squaring the circle is going to be a really critical piece of the puzzle, and we must seize the opportunity to ensure that the workforce has the support and tools needed to develop into the work that's going to need to be done. So I'm particularly interested to hear about the thoughts of the panel on this, which is quite an emotive subject, and particularly areas perhaps where UAE and UK can both learn from each other and potentially collaborate in the future. And I'll maybe just open this out to the panelists and start with yourself, Martin, just to give an introduction to yourself, but importantly, why do you feel this is an important topic?
Yeah, thanks, Ryan, and good afternoon, everyone. I'm Martin Tulloch. I'm part of the team at the Net Zero Technology Centre in Aberdeen. So we're funded by government, by both Scottish and UK government, Our sole purpose is to accelerate the deployment of net zero technology. So we've got no geographical limits. We've got no limits across industry. We only co-invest with industry. That's another important part. So we've got strong partnerships with oil and gas operators, renewable development companies, the supply chain. And to me, skills is one of, I almost call it the elephant in the room, in that everybody knows the technological challenges. Everybody knows about the infrastructure investment required, but I don't think anybody fully gets a grasp of the sheer number of skills we need to deliver those two elements. So really keen to explore that with the rest of the panel over the next 45 minutes.
Peter, the same, just give a brief introduction. Why is this important to yourself?
Yeah, sure. So, hey everyone, Pete Tippler. I'm the Strategic Director at Exodus and Managing Director of X Academy. Over the last few years, I've been working in our renewables business, growing that, and we very quickly started to find a situation where a lot of our consultants were being approached by our clients to go and take jobs up in our client network. And there are two ways you can respond to that. Either you can get defensive, you can start trying to compete on their salaries, or you can start trying to find other ways of retaining them. Or you can recognize that actually this is an industry-wide problem, and there just aren't enough people in industry who can deliver all of the projects that are existing right now. Fast forward to the follow-up to the last conversation, the last panel session, where we talked about additional pace being required, additional R&D, technology innovation being required, additional projects being required. If we think about the fact that right now it's difficult to try and attract and retain enough people into this energy sector, and we're talking about a massive ramp-up of activity over the next 5 to 10 years to achieve net zero, then we're only going to have more and more of a challenge as we go forward. So X Academy is purely designed as a non-profit entity to help accelerate more people into professional careers who can try and deliver progress against those targets.
Thanks, Peter. Andy.
Sure. Good afternoon, everybody. Andy Brown. I'm the Operations Director for the Engineering Construction Industry Training Board, ECITB. Why is this subject important? I don't know how many times the P word, people, were mentioned by the first panel, but those industry leaders clearly recognized the investment that needs to be made in the people that will deliver this program of work. I also look at it from a competitive perspective. And across the world, whether it's UAE, UK, or Australia, or the United States, there is a massive competition for investment. And if we don't have competent people at all levels in project delivery, we will not get that investment. And that's going to be, I hope, raised in the third panel session. So we've got to make sure that we've got the right numbers of people, and that's not happening at the moment. The numbers are staggering. They are competent and safe, whether that's site-based. They are competent at a design level, they're competent at a project management level, they're competent at procurement and contract setting, and above all, and most important, competent leadership.
I'll stay with yourself, Andy. You mentioned making sure that we've got the right level of people, and we don't. And the figures back that up. There's a survey done by National Grid explaining that for the change for net zero, they're going to need almost 120,000 new energy sector jobs in the UK alone by 2030. Well, how are we getting to there? But importantly, what skills are going to be required to get us to that? Layman's terms, is it the same skills that we've got, or is there going to be a new set of skills? So what are you seeing? What do you think we need to do there?
Yeah, it's a changing picture, to be honest, Ryan. I would have said 2 years ago, we commissioned a report that by and large highlighted it's a capacity issue. So we talk about skill shortages, we talk about skills gaps. Skill shortage is those skills are available, we just don't have enough of them. A skills gap is there's a new technology, or there's a new process, or there's a new something, and we don't have the skills to meet that need. The skills gaps are really niche. 2 years ago when we commissioned this report, it's all around the shortage, skill shortage. So when we look at the numbers and the competition in the UK for welders, for example, in Scotland, where shipbuilding is on the rise, the assembly of the massive floating offshore wind turbines that will need to happen over the next 10 years, and then that's before we even consider nuclear new build and new railways. There's just not enough welders. That's a shortage. In the area of gaps, we're starting to see some employers come to us and say we need some training around engineering for hydrogen prime movers, So we do see there are some skills gaps, but you know, that's not the loud voice. It's all about the volume of the existing skills that we have. There's traditional craft and technician, the traditional supervisors, planners, cost engineers, project managers. You know, if you can do any of that, then you're in luck.
So there's a bit of reskilling, and then there's a whole new tranche of skills that are now required to move us forward in this industry.
Yeah, I think when you talk about reskilling, so maybe at a project management level, a leadership level, thinking more about systems approach. Adi mentioned it in the first panel. You've got to start thinking holistically. You've got to think about joining up these different technologies. So your project managers and your engineers have got to be thinking a bit more systems-wise. And I think leadership have got to think a little bit more around early engagement with the supply chain. Matt's comment, you know, I think that's really key around collaboration. It's a word that's used a lot, but not very well understood, I think.
And I'm sure we'll come back to that later on. Peter, I was really interested when you mentioned about the X Academy. Great initiative as well. How are you playing into this, you know, the element of what skills are required, gaps, or reskilling? How is the X Academy playing into that?
Yeah, I think I agree with everything Andy just said about the types of skills and the types of qualification and backgrounds. I think what we're trying to do is provide a contextual and a behavioral layer on top of that. So the modern energy transition professional needs to be able to understand the range of different technologies and how they fit together. They also need to be able to communicate with stakeholders. Our industry is so much closer now to the end users than it ever has been before. So we're trying to provide that sort of holistic sort of wraparound. And actually the skills that we need, it's everyone from the environmental scientists and the technical people. It's people that understand the commercial aspects, so the finance and the legal, but it's also people that are able to talk about our industry and communicate our industry. So I think that's probably where I'd finish there.
Thank you. And we'll keep on this, but I'm going to add on an extra question, perhaps for yourself, Martin. We've seen an evolution in the last few years. I think a few organisations, we went from IOCs to IECs. There's been a few name changes as we move into a wider embracing the energy sector in its fullest form. But here, particularly in the northeast of Scotland, and in fact in the UAE, we're seeing it's traditionally your hydrocarbon, but there's still a skill set there. Do you see, Martin, that these skill sets that we've got in what we would class as traditional oil and gas are transferable into what we are now seeing as a wider energy transition?
I do, Ryan. I've always felt that, and I think it was just backed up by evidence last year. Probably one of the best studies I've seen in this space was carried out by Robert Gordon University here in Aberdeen. And they looked at the transferability of skills between oil and gas and the three growth industries, offshore wind, hydrogen, and carbon capture and storage. So today in the UK, we've got roughly 160,000 people employed in the offshore sector. About 80% of that is in oil and gas, 20% in wind. By 2030, according to their analysis, we'd be up to 200,000 people in those industries, so 40,000 new jobs, but quite a shift in jobs. So oil and gas moves from roughly 140 down to 70. Offshore wind increases dramatically up to maybe 90, 100,000 jobs. Then you've got carbon capture and storage and hydrogen on top of that. The other key thing about that study was they looked at the skill set in oil and gas, and 90% of the job categories had either very high or medium transferability between industries. So I think there's going to be a lot more moving between industries. I myself started off in civil engineering and moved into oil and gas. I spent time in renewables. I developed a green hydrogen project in Outer Hebrides 15 years ago, and the skill sets we needed there to sort of plumb that together were very similar to the skill sets I'd just left behind in oil and gas. So yeah, I think there's huge transferability, Ryan. I agree with Andy, there's not many gaps there. It's more the quantity of people that we need that's going to be the big challenge.
A hydrogen project 15 years ago.
Scotland's second green hydrogen project.
So that's why I love sitting up here, because you're always learning something. I'll walk away. So at that point, and I digress slightly, did you feel at that point, did you question, have we got the skills, or did you just get on and do it?
You know, hydrogen's gone through a number of iterations. Back in the early 70s, Chat Nicholson was driving around Hollywood in a hydrogen-powered car in the first oil price shock. So, and that's when Jimmy Carter was putting solar panels on the White House. But again, back in sort of 2005 to 7, the Scottish Government actually focused on hydrogen as a growth opportunity. was in a period of quite high oil prices. As they decreased, there was sort of a move away from it. The key thing for me, I think, is the first panel touched on, that feels much more real this time round because it's driven by society. So Greta Thunberg's had much more impact than Al Gore ever had in the mid-2000s. There's something concrete. We know, as Professor Mercedes mentioned, there's no planet B, so we've got to get it right this time.
I think they always say necessity is the mother of all invention. And last week I watched, if anyone's watched on Netflix, the DeLorean documentary. If you get a chance, it's very good to see, but it's interesting. So the DeLorean, if you don't know, the car from Back to the Future, unmitigating disaster commercially, but it was actually built by John DeLorean back in the early 70s when the oil price was coming, the crash, because this was lightweight, it was made from steel. The idea was that this was going to precipitate the oil crash, particularly in the US. It didn't quite work out that way, but you could see the thinking behind it. And being in Aberdeen this week and seeing so many people, you almost feel as you're an ambassador. And I think he's maybe still in the audience, but Wood always strikes me because Wood is a company that has had to reskill from its early iterations, fishing vessels to supply vessels to now this multinational company doing everything in all parts of the world. And that's something I think that the UK has always been good at, adapting and the reskilling aspect. But Andy, I'm going to come back with yourself about the transferable skills. Yep. Do you see that this is something that we pushed down when we talked about the basic project management, your civil engineering skills, etc.? You know, is it as simple as just a little tweak, or is there a lot more to be done?
I think you'll always have an element of a delta. You know, whether an individual moves from company to company, sector to sector, but at the end of the day, your core craft and technician trades will be readily transferable. I think what the key lesson for countries like the UAE, for example, that I think we can provide is making sure that you get a good collaborative approach to recognizing the competence required as people move from point A to point B. Because we can talk about transferable skills. If you're a receiving company or a receiving sector and your competence framework is different from the donor sector, you're going to create hurdles and lumps, and that's cost and that's waste. And so it's about, particularly for countries that are, you know, maybe not as advanced as we are, not advanced wasn't the right word, haven't made as many mistakes as we have, that's better. It's about understanding what that framework looks like, collaborating on that framework, and making sure you don't build in a whole lot of hoops unnecessarily at the very beginning. So if you're a mechanical fitter in the oil and gas industry, you know, what is the delta that you need to move into offshore wind? Don't say you have to retest in exactly the same way as you were tested and competence was assured in the oil and gas industry. You know, there's a lot of waste that has gone on, and we're addressing that now, but it's taken us a very long time. So it's very easy to say transferable skills. It's how easily can they transfer?
And it's a good point. Have we knocked out some of the bureaucracy in that? Like one of the things I particularly, I know it sounds really straightforward, but when moving over to the UAE, one of the first things you want to do is get out driving again. You've passed your test in the UK, you've got your driving license. It's a simple case of going to their equivalent of the DVLA, switching it, because you've already shown your level of competence, and then you are issued with your UAE driving license, and that is it. Is that what we're seeing here, or is there still levels of bureaucracy? And then when you talk about collaboration, how are we collaborating to minimize them or get rid of them if we can?
Yeah, I wouldn't say, I wouldn't go as far as to say there's levels of bureaucracy. I think there has been for some time, and we're overcoming this, working collaboratively with primarily the main contractors in the basin. We are understanding the common assurance requirements, and we're getting those common assurance requirements set out so that if you have got assurance from contractor A, contractor B will accept that assurance. And that's not been the case. And it was, you know, you talk about necessity being the driver of invention. You know, that was driven by the low oil price of 2014. That meant employers were, you know, picking up every single stone to see where there were savings that could be made. And we were finding out that technicians were being trained 3 or 4 times a year as they moved from asset to asset. which was clearly wasteful. So that's where you've got to focus on some real efficiencies in skills transferability, whether it's from, exporting UK workers to the UAE, or because we're short of skills in the UK, back from the UAE to the UK. We can do it country to country, sector to sector, asset to asset.
So Andy has mentioned collaboration. You mentioned it as well. And obviously the X Academy, I'm going to assume there's a large collaborative element there. Peter, if it's going to be this collaborative element, who has to be involved? Who's the main stakeholders?
Yeah, I think actually that's a very relevant question to what I was wanting to make a quick comment on something Andy said there, and it relates to this. It's easy to talk about transferability of skills between oil and gas and renewables, but we need to try and find ways of changing the language around that, and that's because we can't risk this idea that we have to leave oil and gas to go and work in a renewable sector. We need to start talking about this as an energy sector as a whole, and that's where I'm coming to from the collaboration point. This is a sector-wide challenge that's affecting oil and gas. It's affecting the decarbonisation work we just talked about in the previous panel. It's affecting battery storage. It's affecting decarbonising heat. There's a whole range of energy sector topics which require the skills that the oil and gas industry has, but is competing for exactly the same set of resource across the whole of the energy sector. So when it comes to collaboration, we need the different sector champions from a public sector level. We also need the different sector champions from the private sector, so the big majors, but we also need the supply chain companies involved in that as well. This has to be a sector-wide, energy sector-wide collaboration activity, understanding the skills requirements.
It sounds like a huge task in itself. I agree with you when you see the rebranding of the energy sector, and I think we are starting to do that in some way. But when you look at it there with all the various stakeholders, if they're each in that silo, that's a large task to go through and undertake, but not overcome, not one that can't be overcome. Martin, I just add you into this, obviously, within the Net Zero Technology Centre. That's a key area for you, is the collaborative space that you're working in between the UAE, between the UK, and amongst many of your companies. Where do you see the key players? And maybe building on Peter's point, how would we overcome that challenge?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think in terms of the key players, something we found out at COP26, we launched a collaborative effort with similar organisations in other countries. So we've now got 12 organisations from 10 different countries, all tackling the same sorts of challenges, all wanting to invest in the renewables, be it solar or wind, in green and blue hydrogen and CCS. And something we're doing is trying to work together to share some of the experience, share some of the technology learnings, with a view to presenting the findings at COP27 and hopefully taking that on into real action by COP28 in the UAE. So to me, one of the key points is trying to encourage and enthuse the next generation. So as the Deputy Ambassador said, we need to get the younger generation engaged and involved. If you look at the infrastructure build out, yet we need all the skills we have today to get to 2030, but the real build out happens between 2030 and 2040, 45. And the workforce that we need in that period are in primary school today. So we need to have that focus on STEM and inspiring people to get involved in engineering and mathematics. And that, I think, is a bigger sort of industry-wide challenge. It's a global challenge. It's the sort of thing that I think IRENA, being based in the UAE, they provide some really good strategic guidance. We've got a local equivalent in the UK, the Climate Change Committee, that provide quite robust guidance. It's just trying to coordinate a lot of that global demand and feed it down into the education system in particular. So again, government alignment, everything from energy policy, education skills policy, and that financial piece that we'll talk about in the next session.
You've picked up on a really important part that was touched upon, as I was fully expect within the previous panel, about attracting people into the industry. And I was talking to a number of people at lunchtime. My eldest daughter is just sitting her E-levels as we speak, and will go to the University of Glasgow to study mathematics come September. So she's definitely sitting in that STEM environment, ticking the right boxes. But when I ask her, are you interested in coming to the energy sector? Maybe. It's not really inspiring her at the moment. And I'm going to pick up on 2 points here. Not only is it about attracting the next generation, but making sure we diversify the workforce. How are we looking to encourage the next generation, but also underrepresented bodies such as our female or certainly ethnic minorities? What are we doing to encourage them to come in? I'll maybe start with yourself, Peter, on that, because I think this is a key point.
Absolutely, and it's a really key part of how we've designed Next Academy, and we've got some way to go to get it right as well. But it's two things really. One is meaningful work. We have to work hard at creating, and that's another part of collaboration, but creating the opportunities and the projects for people to work on things which enable them to have a tangible impact on the industry. And a lot of that comes down to how we talk about what those projects mean, what they deliver, what their relevance is. Again, that comes back to that behavioral piece, the ability to communicate about our industry. The second aspect of that, of course, is the diversity aspect you pointed out. There's diversity, whether it's gender diversity or perspectives, backgrounds, skill sets. It's a demand side issue, not a supply side issue. We know all the people are out there that can come and join this industry, but we've got to create that demand. We've got to be inclusive and look inclusive and really go the extra mile to make it a really accessible industry. We haven't necessarily done that well with this panel session, for example, as it happens. Yeah. But that's, we've really got to work hard at that and make it obvious that there is demand for diversity.
Yeah. Thank you. Andy.
Can I just go back to the collaboration point very quickly?
Of course.
Thank you. Collaboration isn't easy. It's a word that's used an awful lot. It requires groups who have a lot of self-interest to come together and align to a single objective, and that is very, very difficult. So I'll just let that little doom kind of comment just lie there. As far as attracting people into the industry, this is such a multifaceted piece. It goes from, and it was great what Natasha said earlier, it goes from let's not talk about green jobs, let's not talk about net zero in the role of trying to recruit people. We have got a major target here that we're trying to achieve. We need people across all of the specters, all of the skill sets, all of the projects. And if you're going to be working in a hydrocarbon project, what the messaging should be around, this is part of that journey. You are part of this plan. So let's start getting the messaging right. That's one point. The other thing that I think we miss a big trick is we tend to hone in on the government's framework for recruitment, and it's generally apprenticeships. In Scotland and England, it's generally apprenticeships. I'm not sure what it is in the UAE. To get on an apprentice, you need an employer. So the individual needs to be employed. So from a contracting perspective, you need to have got work. So you're already behind the drag curve because you're now recruiting an apprentice when you've just won work. Well, it's too late. And then from an input standard for that apprenticeship, you need to be level 3 in England, you need to be level 6 or level 7. I'm looking at Jenny from SDS, just a nod to make sure I got that right. To get onto an apprenticeship in Scotland. Okay, there's some varying there. But we don't always need those people that are that academically gifted to do the kind of work we need. We need semi-skilled people, we need industrial operatives, we need people who are willing to weld all day. Doesn't necessarily need to have, an A-level in maths. So we need to be a little bit smarter about our entry points. We can lower them, we could broaden them. Give people progressive pathways once they're in. Those that show really good aptitude and attitude, they have a progressive pathway. So it sounds like lowering the bar. It's not lowering the bar, it's broadening the funnel to get people into industry. And then, of course, we've got to work on making it an attractive industry from an inclusivity perspective. And I'm sorry, I don't have an answer for that because that is a huge subject. Yeah. Our workforce census we did last year showed that I think it was something like 86% of the workforce in the contracting community is white and male. And 50% of the employers that responded to the how do you recruit, it's word of mouth. So you straight away see that we're limiting the input standard because you've got to be an apprentice. So we're missing a whole load of capable people below that level. And then we're really limiting the talent pool by word of mouth being your recruitment methodology when 86% of the workforce is white and male. So there's got to be a massive shift on how we recruit people.
And it leads me a nice point. We were meant to have a fourth panelist today, and unfortunately, Ali Abdullah from Petra Pak, the UAE country chair, couldn't be with us today. But when we were doing some prep for this, he was really quite passionate about this when we were talking, and he mentioned that within Petra Pak, and I know Robert and Alex are in the audience, and I don't know if he was referring to globally or just in the UAE, but he was really proud that 73% of the engineers in Petra Pak are women. And Stuart alluded to earlier on the UAE Reconnect event where he was with the co-chair for the UUBC Energy and Sustainability group, Khalifa from Taziz, and there a large percentage of the attendees were female. If you looked at the ADNOC personnel in the room, now largely they're from SP, I know, John, you're going to be presenting there on Wednesday morning, 90% female, all extremely engaged. I see it in the universities in the UAE, be it Khalifa University, the PI, there are a huge amount. I'd maybe be interested to speak to Mercedes and some others later on here, if that's being replicated in the UK. I certainly agree with you, there's still a long journey, but from what I have seen, and actually Peter, picking up on your point, what we saw last 2 weeks ago, the panels were almost a 50-50 male-female split, but it was done organically. Nothing was targeted. It was because they were the right person that was sitting in that role. So I look at it as the father of two young daughters going, actually, it's definitely going in the right way and it's not being pushed, but I'd be interested to see where it is here. I'm going to take a second and ask if there are any questions or observations on that from the audience, because I'm aware that there are many people that have come out from the UAE for this, and they may wish to add to any of the comments myself or the panel have made there. Yeah. There's a microphone just coming your way, sir.
Hello, my name's Andrew Monker from Igneous Solutions. Yeah, great panel. I've enjoyed today. It's been really good and interesting. I've actually lived in Dubai since '99, so I've seen the transformation there, but now I'm back living in the UK. But the question I had was about upskilling and reskilling. You know, those are two different things. And then especially, you know, we were talking about collaboration, but this is definitely an opportunity that we need to stop thinking within silos. You know, there are people from the mining industry, you know, from the railway, from aerospace. You know, this is a perfect chance for us to be, you know, not thinking, well, this is an oil and gas problem. We're gonna fix this in house. So just wanted to hear your views on that and the whole upskilling and reskilling, retention of people, because that's going to be the most important thing. Thank you.
Thanks, Andrew. I'll maybe start with yourself on that, Martin.
Yeah, absolutely. I think a great point, Andrew. I think I'll maybe focus on the transferability across industries. I think I absolutely, totally agree with you. We need to look more broadly. I think we also need to change the way that we advertise and that we accommodate people. So we've got a really great technology startup program called TakeX. It's actually co-sponsored by ADNOC, by BP Ventures, by Equinor Ventures, and by Accenture. Now, historically, we had a very small percentage of the actual successful applicants with female founders in the team. So we took a much more deliberate approach and we went through different channels. We made the process online as well. We made the actual program online, which made it much more flexible, and we increased that in the last cohort to over 60% of the founding teams having a female founder on board. So I think there's that element, but to me, that again, I mentioned right at the start, the elephant in the room being the skills shortage. I think other industries are going to really feel the pinch as well, because those 200,000 jobs offshore that I mentioned, you could add on top of that the hydrogen export opportunity. So the Scottish Government have got an ambitious hydrogen export scenario. ARUP did all the technical work that underpins that. They're talking about exporting 100 terawatt hours of hydrogen to Europe each year. We know there's huge demand in Germany and Holland. That could be another 200,000 jobs. Then you look at the sort of home insulation need. We need to get that. That's something that's quite often forgotten about in the transition. Deploying heat pumps as well. It's a whole new skill set that we just don't have enough coverage in at the moment. So I do fear that we're all operating in our own silos, and even those other industries that we traditionally attract people into as the oil industry booms are going to come under increasing pressure. But as for the transferability, I think Andy's probably a better place to comment.
We'll move on to Andy and then to yourself, Peter.
Yeah, it's a great question, Andrew, because we've just suffered recently from an attempt to bring in a progressive pathway for a discipline, for a minor project that's going on down in Somerset. Collaboration, we work with the client, we work with the contracting alliance to understand the demands of the role, put in place the training program, started to get the learners into that progressive route, so they come in as a general operative, they then get split to a mechanical or electrical, and then on the electrical pathway, they'll go into doing work like containment fitting and cable pulling. And that's when it all fell down, because the unions felt that was taking qualified technicians' jobs. So we missed a little bit of the collaboration, although we felt that we had the union backing at the time that we first agreed this. It clearly didn't permeate all the way through. So we've got to learn lessons from that, and I think some of the things that we need to focus on around getting out of silos is say, okay, let's pick a region, let's pick something like Teesside that Matt was mentioning earlier, and work with some clients and major contractors and STEM organizations and providers to build those pipelines where we can have a progressive upskilling program. And as long as they're qualified to accepted standards, you'll be building in transferability as you go. So that for me is the sort of lesson identified from Hinkley Point, where we didn't quite get it right and we had to go back to the drawing board. So I think building that regional identity in that sort of clustered way, coalition way, might help kind of soften some of those issues that we had.
Thanks, Andy. Peter, would you like to build on that?
Yeah, I think maybe it's a good time to just quickly introduce the funding partners of X Academy, because that part of how that's been structured has allowed us to focus on different types of groups of people. So first of all, Energy Transition Zone Limited have provided 1.6 million out of the Northeast Economic Recovery and Skills Fund. And that fund, and in particular, 1.6 million, was targeted at people who are perhaps estranged from the workforce, in the energy transition workforce. So maybe they've lost their job over the last few years, or just have graduated from university and haven't got access to those jobs yet. Or it's people who are looking to leave armed forces, or are looking to move from adjacent sectors with relevant skills and coming into the energy transition sector. So that fund was absolutely targeted at those types of groups of people, and being very deliberate about trying to go and find the right skills from adjacent industries. The second funding partner that we've got on board, and we're always, we're building a collaboration of as many funding partners as we can find, really. But the second one was BP and its consortium partner in ScotWind, EMBW. Now, their attitude was slightly different. They wanted to see new people coming into sector, but they also wanted the opportunity, and it's built into our contract with them, to almost second or place people from within the BP organisation into X Academy for periods of time to help give them a broader exposure to energy transition topics that they didn't necessarily have the projects for quick enough within the BP organisation. And that's interesting, considering the scale of BP, that was a challenge that they were trying to address through their talent programs. So two different approaches there, one relating to the transferability and one relating to bringing people in from adjacent sectors. But you have to be deliberate about doing both of those things.
I'm conscious that we are getting close to the end of time, but I'd like us all to finish on, and we've certainly used the collaboration word a lot, so why not add in a couple of others here? But I'd like you, and there's no right or wrong answer here, I think it's just what you feel personally, but give one recommendation on what you think can be done to encourage closer collaboration between the two respective countries, the UAE and UK, on the skills agenda in the energy sector. I'll start with yourself, Martin, if I may.
Yeah, mate, a great question, Ryan. I think for me it's all about partnership, true partnership. And one of the points that Lord Rodney Lister made was looking at the sort of the mutual benefits for both countries. So fabrication is one example. I think in offshore wind, as the first panel rightly mentioned, we have not secured enough of the sort of offshore wind booms so far in the UK. I think if we could work in partnership with other countries, the UAE included, that have fabrication capability, and look at modular fabrication. That's something that we focus on in our floating wind portfolio. Technologies that could be fabricated elsewhere and assembled here, so that there's benefits to both countries. That is something, and that goes across the board for hydrogen technology, electrolyzers, CCUS kit. So I think that there is that piece, and then there's the customer piece. So we all talk about Germany as being the big hydrogen export market. The UAE are targeting it, we're targeting it. There's a lot to be gained if we can work in partnership with hydrogen customers and other hydrogen suppliers, just to try and get that security of supply that everybody's yearning for at the moment.
Thank you, Martin. What's your recommendation, Peter?
So my recommendation would be around trying to ensure that we're getting more bang for buck for everything that is invested in. So if there is we talked before about UAE-UK investment projects. Well, if every single one of those investment projects includes an element of training, and we know that people will learn and develop better if they're working on real projects, then combine the two things together. So as an example, right now we have people working on a project in Australia which has investment behind it to take it forward. It's going to need people to work on it long term. So we've got X-Academy people working on that project to help develop it and progress it. At the same time, it's being developed and progressed. And at a point at which that gets sort of final investment decision, there'll be a team of people who understand it wholeheartedly. They've come into the sector. The project has been able to progress in a more appropriate timescale, and it's a win-win scenario for both the project, for the entities behind it, and for the individuals involved. So don't wait. Don't treat skills and professional development in a silo in its own right. Involve that in the projects that are being created when they're being created.
Good point. Andy.
So you asked for one recommendation. I'll give you three if I may.
Okay.
But it'll be very quick.
If they're quick, that's fine.
I think the first one, sort of export from us to the UAE, our knowledge and understanding of occupational standards and competence assurance, and particularly the lessons that we've identified in trying to build a framework. Import from the UAE, their success story around diversity. And then the final one, export from the UK, the legislative framework that gives us an industrial training levy. It's a collaborative levy that is forced through statute, but it's something that works because industry votes on it every 3 years, and they vote it in every 3 years. So there's something around that legislative framework that forces collaboration on skills. Those that consume the skills pay for it in a redistributive way.
Thank you. I'm also acutely aware, sitting up here, that we've heard three fantastic viewpoints, but we're all UK-based. So I'm going to deviate from script. I completely am deviating from script, so I am going to put him on the spot, Nick. And the reason is, Nick Cochrane-Diet is probably the person that I would go to most, and he has been in the UAE more than I have been on this earth, and a really good ambassador. And I'm just interested, Nick, and apologies for putting you on the spot, but the same, from your side, what do you think the UAE and the UK could do collaboratively in this skills gap reskilling agenda, just based on your thought? And Nick works for BP, but is also the chairman of the Abu Dhabi British Chamber of Commerce, and I really appreciate your thoughts on this, Nick.
Thank you, Ryan, and thank you to the panelists. I mean, I think we're all talking the same language, which is wonderful, and collaboration is the word that I'm hearing from both panels, which is obviously what this UUBC is all about. It's about sharing our experiences. Now, I had the pleasure of sitting next to Andy at lunchtime. I had no idea that Andy's institute existed, and it's a fantastic, and I think that what you've got there could easily be brought into the UAE. But to answer your question, Ryan, about what can be brought from the UAE to the UK, I think there's tons of stuff, and you actually mentioned some of it. I mean, the diversity and inclusion in the Emirates is there. It's a given, it's automatic, people don't even have to talk about it. it's not given, and you gave some good examples. I mean, 60%, opportunities for inclusion and diversity in this country could be shared from the Emirates and brought into this way. You mentioned welders. Lamprell, for example, are building bits and pieces for wind turbines for offshore. The welders are there. They're in a different country. They can put the stuff, make the stuff there, and they are bringing it to the UK, and it gets put onto the offshore here. But it's the communication between the two that is sadly a little bit perhaps opportunity for improvement. And, well done, Brad, and well done, UUBC, for bringing us all together, for raising these things, because it's only by raising them that we're going to continuously improve. What the UAE has achieved in my lifetime is just from 0 to 100 in 50 years. I mean, literally 0. And so the next 50 years is going to be even quicker and more, because there's now a generation that's coming into leadership that has had education. And so what they can bring to this country is that speed of execution, the dynamism. There's lots of great innovation here, clearly. But how long did it take Hinkley Point to get all worked out and decided and blah, blah, blah? In that time, they went from nothing on nuclear to having 2 nuclear reactors functioning commercially. So they've got that ability to execute. And some of that technology and that can do, that have done, perhaps could be shared with the UK. And, people like Lord Lister and Ahmed Al-Said, they talk to each other. It's that way the Prime Minister, the new President of the UAE, pushing it down. There are plenty of willing people, but we need to collaborate better. We need to communicate more. It's not that it's bad, it's more. And I think the most important bit is not just the collaboration, it's the execution quicker. Because we're not going to make that climate change, I'm afraid, the rate we're going at the moment, which is why I'm really happy that COP28 is going to be in Abu Dhabi, in the UAE, because they will deliver. But your expertise in helping that delivering is required. The population in the UAE is tiny. We've got population here. So do the hydrogen and stuff in Teesside, because there's a population here. Take it to the UAE, they will execute quickly and show you how to bring these things forward quickly. And, it was good to hear Martin talk about BP Ventures with ADNOC. I mean, it's that kind of collaboration. It's there. It's just not perhaps being promoted as well as it could be. So more UUBCs, and thank you, Brad, and thank you to UUBC, and thank you to EIC and EEC Connect tomorrow and the next day, because it's all about that collaboration, that networking that Stuart mentioned before at ADNOC, and I hope to see you all at ADNOC, if not before.
Thank you so much, Nick. Again, I'm unscripted. Nick certainly isn't. That's fantastic. I think I would just echo the collaboration continues, and I think Brad and the team, fantastic for putting this on, but not only that, but keeping it as a series of roadshows up to COP28, and you will have my full support on that, I'm sure, from everyone in the room to keep that going. I think we've got one question. I'm going to just thank everyone, because I know we've got our next panel question or session, or you?
If I may echo just Nick here.
Sure.
My name is Ahmed Al-Mizrahi from Abu Dhabi Mubadala. If I may echo Nick here, again, I thank UUBC on this setup. I think, in my opinion, is the regulator need to be part of this discussion and engagement. Listening to the previous session and this session, there are so many languages, from a technology side of the business, operation side of the business, financial, investment. So these are languages that the regulator need to listen to it and get familiar with it in order to speed up the execution. The government body, again, in most of the country, I'm talking about Abu Dhabi here, they tend to listen to the regulator in addition to the operators, the business investment team. So I would personally suggest that, the experience, the know-how you've got here, transfer it to Abu Dhabi. Don't forget the regulator.
Yeah.
In my opinion, regulator need to listen to this.
I think it's a good point. Thank you. And thank you all for staying with us for this session. And hopefully it's been interesting. These conversations, as they never do, they never stop. So carry it on into the evening. It's great to see that there is the mixture of people here from the UAE and the UK. You're starting to see who they are now. The final thanks go to Andy, Peter and Martin, the panelists. Thanks, gentlemen, for giving up the time today. Really enjoyed that. And please enjoy the remainder of your day.
Thank you.
Thank you.